Hello and welcome to this webinar on effective maths teaching in the current context. This evening's webinar is presented by the PTST Post-Primary Maths team. Our email address is on the screen for any queries about the content, approaches, or our supports that you may have during or after this webinar. We are absolutely delighted to welcome our panelists and thank them for giving their time to share their knowledge and experience of blended learning in their own school contexts. This evening's panel consists of Yvonne Marley, maths teacher in Old Bawn Community School in Tallaght, Joe Geraghty, maths teacher in St. Gerald's College in Castlebar, Aidan Roach, maths teacher in Coláiste na Bríde in Enniscorthy, and the panel discussion will be chaired by myself, Arlene Murphy, maths teacher in Marion College, Dublin, and seconded as a full-time advisor to the PTST Post-Primary Maths team. We'll hear from our panelists a little later in the webinar. Here's an overview of the running order for this evening. It will consist of two main sessions. In the first one, we'll briefly share some background on blended learning approaches before going through an example of how this could be implemented in lessons. The examples that we're demonstrating this evening use the topic of complex numbers, but the approaches behind the examples are designed to be used in any topic and at any level. This first example will be followed by a panel discussion. And the panel discussion will focus on current COVID-19 related challenges that teachers are facing in the classroom. That discussion will lead us into session 2, where we will demonstrate another example of blended learning using a rich task and explore how this could work in different contexts. We will then hold our second panel discussion, which includes a Q&A session. The second panel discussion will focus on developing sustainable good practice around blended learning. First of all, we ask that there is no recording, video or audio made of this webinar. PTST do not grant permission to record. We will, however, make the presentation section available online afterwards. Now, I'm going to take 2 minutes to run through some webinar guidelines and check that everyone is aware of how to use the technology, how you'll be able to ask questions, etc. To help this webinar run smoothly, we have muted all attendees' microphones. So we ask that you type your question into the Q&A function. The Q&A icon is at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we would encourage you to use this with any questions that you may have during the webinar. You should also be able to see and to like other people's questions. We hope to respond to some of the most popular questions later on this evening. PTST advisors are also working in the background, and they will respond to questions during and after the webinar. During the course of the evening, some quick multiple choice poll questions will appear on your screen. And we ask that you respond to these polls to help direct the webinar. Before we go any further, we would like to remind you that it is not our team's role to answer questions specific to state exams or CBAs, and that support for specific software is not the purpose of this webinar. We do have a range of videos to support maths teachers in using Google Forms and Microsoft platforms on skulnet.ie. Any links or important information will be shared with you using the chat function. You should see a notification when something is posted in chat. You should see a link for this SkullNet resource arrive in your chat function. So as you can see, we have a broad range of experience and levels of people who are attending. Thank you so much for responding. This is the current PTST Post-Primary Maths team. Our email addresses will be included in a Padlet page that will be shared. Do not hesitate to contact any member of the team for resource ideas or information. I would also encourage all Twitter users to follow us on Twitter using @projectmaths_IE. And if you are not already subscribed to our newsletter, we will share a link for subscription in the chat function now. By following us on Twitter or subscribing to our newsletter, you can keep up to date with all of our supports and all our upcoming events. This image shows the range of supports offered by the PTST Post-Primary Maths team. Again, if you have any questions about any of these supports, do not hesitate to get in touch with us. At the end of the webinar, we will highlight our upcoming events and supports. All the resources associated with this webinar have been collated on a Padlet page. This link will be posted in chat, and it will also be emailed to you after the webinar. When you click into the Padlet, you will see information from the PTST Blended Learning page, from SkullNet, some Project Maths resources, as well as other informative documents and resources. Now, let's take a look at our key messages for this webinar. Blended learning can help with the current COVID-19 related challenges in teaching mathematics in our schools. In the longer term, we should develop sustainable good practice in this area of our teaching. And blended learning facilitates the use of rich tasks to support and extend all our students. We are going to consider briefly what we mean by blended learning. This link shown on the slide will bring you to the PTST Blended Learning page, which contains a lot more information about blended learning approaches and useful links. I would also like to remind you that PTST advisors are available to support your school through a school visit, through video calls, through phone calls. As you're aware, the national response to the COVID-19 pandemic thrust schools into distance learning with minimal preparation. The move from traditional face-to-face teaching was necessary and immediate, leaving limited time for teachers to prepare. Teachers put in a huge amount of work in a very difficult and uncertain situation when schools were closed. As we meet this evening, teachers and students are still in a challenging and constantly changing situation. Schools may be required to provide both in-school and remote learning support during this school year, and there are a number of considerations that schools will have to take on board when planning their approach to blended learning appropriate to their context. The purpose of this webinar is to explore some of these approaches through the experience of our panelists and framed by 2 mathematics activities. The DES framework for reopening and operating schools, published on June 12, 2020, stated that teachers will be required to continue to adapt their lesson planning and pedagogy to provide for a blended approach to teaching, learning, and assessment as a contingency measure. This requirement makes sense as schools deal with the current uncertainty, with some students being required to self-isolate, vulnerable students unable to attend, students absent for other reasons, physical distancing requirements, etc. The reality is that blended learning has been happening for a long time now. And this evening, we will explore some theory behind the blended learning approach for use in our current context. When we say blended learning, we are referring to a flexible model that can support teaching and learning without necessarily requiring teachers and learners to be in the same physical space at all times. The learning experience can be either synchronous, which entails live online lessons or experiences in real time, or asynchronous online learning experiences, which are not in real time. There are 2 models for blended learning that lend themselves to the Irish context. Using the flipped classroom, students are introduced to new concepts or content at home, and daily classroom time is spent on practicing and applying their understanding through teacher-led or peer-led discussion, debate, structured activities, and open-ended collaborative projects. Through the enriched virtual model, students explore topics in class with their teachers and then complete online activities at home at their own pace. The enriched virtual model differs from the flipped classroom because students do not need to meet face-to-face with their teachers every single day. Both the flipped classroom and the enriched virtual model could have synchronous and asynchronous elements. This can be done using virtual learning environments, such as Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom, Zoom, etc. In this webinar, we will focus on examples in a mathematics classroom. Keeping in mind the key skills for senior cycle, Blended learning presents an opportunity to place the student at the center of the learning process and encourage an inquiry-based approach. The effective use of digital technologies can deepen students' learning and facilitate a constructivist approach to the teaching and learning of mathematics. The use of GeoGebra as an investigative tool can support students in co-constructing knowledge and becoming independent learners. The use of pre-recorded screencasts or videos can provide a stimulus for students to engage with offline. When supported by the use of effective questioning and student reflection, these can be used to encourage students to think critically and develop their problem-solving skills. When students return to the classroom, the teacher can facilitate rich discussion, addressing common misconceptions and leading students to a deeper understanding of the key learning. You can also find some resources on formative assessment developed by the NCCA on the Padlet page. These include resources on effective questioning and student reflection. When planning for the blended learning environment, we need to consider rich task design that supports teaching, learning, and assessment. The constructivist model encourages students to interact with content around established learning intentions and build on their prior knowledge. Formative assessment can be provided throughout the task, ensuring that students receive feedback and have the opportunity to respond to that feedback. This feedback may be from the teacher, from their peers, or others, depending on how the learning is shared. Planning the learning for before, during, and after the online activities will help provide a richer experience for students. Okay, so a lot of our attendees have experience using both, and hopefully we'll go through some examples of how these can be done. We will now hear from Angela, who will share some ideas of blended learning tasks using the topic of complex numbers. These methodologies, approaches, and ideas can be used in any topic and at any level.
So that we can think about blended learning in the maths classroom, we are going to look at an example activity to investigate the effects of multiplying complex numbers. Before seeing this task, students would have worked with an Argand diagram and explored the modulus and argument of a complex number. They would be familiar with the geometric view of number and understand that multiplying by I results in a 90-degree rotation. Students are going to investigate what happens when two complex numbers are multiplied together. As with traditional classroom methods, the use of effective questioning and classroom collaboration will be key to supporting students' learning. This task is presented to students in the form of an open question. What is the effect on Z1 of multiplying by Z2? Some students might need additional scaffolding to support the exploration of this question and may need to consider examples such as what is 2i multiplied by 3i? 8 months ago, students could have shared electronic devices and printed materials. They could have looked into each other's copies and easily discussed the activity. The teacher could have walked between the desks, observing, taking up written work, and inviting students up to the board. A lot of these strategies are off the table at the moment, but as much as possible, we still want to engage our students in learning activities where they can construct their own knowledge, record, share, and communicate their observations, and also make and justify conclusions. Teachers still want to be able to assess students' daily progress and give them formative feedback. Could we use group work to complete this task? How might this be done at this time? What blended learning techniques could you use on an activity like this one? Before we think about how students might plot their work, we'll consider how they might collaborate. Would a shared document or spreadsheet like this one work? How could your students access this document? The idea here is that once the investigation is complete, the information from each group is recorded in a master file that can be shared with the class. Could the use of dynamic software such as GeoGebra help your students with this investigation? Can your students access GeoGebra in the classroom? This prepared GeoGebra file is available for you on the Padlet. If students have access to a device, then they can record and share the information from their seats. For example, is OneNote an option in the classroom. Students could complete their investigation and record their information into the master table. Could your students use mini whiteboards? Maybe there's a whiteboard page in the school journal. Could they use their phone to submit photos or for data entry? As each group is inputting to the master table, the teacher can check that the conclusions are mathematically correct. In some cases, the teacher may need to provide a group with additional questions to either justify their thinking, support their investigation, or address a misconception. For example, they could encourage students to study and compare the numbers in the table, or to reorder the information to look for a pattern. The teacher can ask individual students to clarify their thinking and to help deepen their understanding of the problem. Students can also avail of peer support to compare ideas, which may help to address misconceptions or misunderstandings. The teacher can then facilitate a whole class discussion to address any misconceptions that arise during the investigation, to ensure that these misconceptions are corrected. The conclusions from each group could be generalized and presented in a summary table. For students that have completed their investigation, some extension questions may be needed in order to further the investigation. There is a link on the Padlet to the NCCA documentation on the use of effective questioning. The teacher should ensure they use a variety of students to present, summarise, and challenge the statements from each of the groups. If the teacher summarises the conclusions from each group into a master table, they can then use this table as a stimulus for discussion, and the pattern should begin to emerge for students. It is important at this stage not to rush the discussion, to ask questions, to probe for clarity, and to ask students to restate a previous conclusion. The use of prediction questions can help students to recognise the progression. Some students will recognise the pattern more quickly. It is really important that these students are appropriately challenged. To extend this task, students could be asked more challenging questions around the location of the product, what conditions would lead to an answer on a particular axis. We are setting the groundwork for exploration of the conjugate and a deeper understanding of the geometric view of complex numbers. Finally, the teacher will provide a summary of the key learning. Students should submit a concluding statement and a reflection on the learning. At the end of the discussion, students will need time to reflect on the key learning, to summarise the key concepts, and to formalise their conclusions.
It is now my pleasure to reintroduce our panellists for our first panel discussion. Welcome, Yvonne, Joe, and Aidan, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. I suppose I'd like to start with some introductions for our attendees. So I'd like you to introduce yourself, give a little bit about your background, your school context, and how you would see an approach like the one we've just seen working in your school environment. So Yvonne, we might start with you, if that's okay.
Hi Arlene, and thanks very much for having me on. My name is Yvonne Marley. I'm a maths teacher and a year head at Old Bawn Community School. Old Bawn is a very large school. It has over 1,000 students, mixed school, and in Tala, just outside Dublin. In our school, but there was two things that struck me about the video. First of all was group work, and group work in the current context is very challenging. So before COVID, even in my classroom setting, I would have the students' desks grouped in groups of 4 or 6, and every time I would set a task, the students would discuss the task and carry out the task, and that's now obviously very challenging because at the moment the students are all in rows, a metre apart, and not everyone is even present in the room. You might have some out in learning spaces and some students joining from home. With regards to group work, I suppose I've just had to accept that the conversation is very loud, and that students, from a speaking perspective and sharing thoughts perspective while they're working, it's just very loud in the room, and they share their work by taking photographs of their work and sharing it on their phones. And how this could be done in a blended setting. So I was thinking about how I would, if I was teaching this lesson and I was approaching it, how I would do it. I think I would start at the end of the class and explain the task and ask the students how they would, explain to the students how to carry out the task. And then I would ask them to do it for homework. I've kind of discovered since lockdown and since we came back that students are kind of addressing their homework all at the same time. a lot of our students do supervised study, so a lot of them do their homework during supervised study. And what I've been encouraging the students to do is to take pictures of their work and to upload questions they have onto the Teams facility within Microsoft. So like Teams have a chat function. It almost works like a little bit of a blog. So for every question, the students would start a new thread, and then they could upload questions or comments they had on their work, putting up pictures of their work. And really what that kind of does is it creates a community of learning with the students after school and supports them in their work. And it really facilitates kind of the blended approach where students are working from home or from in supervised study individually, but not on their own. So I think that didn't exist before lockdown, and that's something that I definitely plan on keeping up even after this is finished.
That sounds brilliant, Yvonne, the fact that you're having your students collaborate with each other in this blended learning space. We might move on to yourself, Joe. Again, just a little introduction, background, and how you would see an approach like this working in your school context.
Yeah, thanks, Arlene. Thanks for having me again. Just similar enough to Yvonne, I thought I was in a large school, but she said a very large. So our school is St. Gerald's College. There's about 600 students. And my name is Joe Bertie as well. I think that's written there. And just what came from the video for me was, and what I found difficult since the last 5 or 6 weeks since we got back starting in school, is not actually being able to see the students' work, as in not being able to go down to the students' desks or seeing what they're writing. So it's good. Obviously, the discussion is happening, but actually what they're actually writing down, I found quite difficult. So what I've been trying to do, and I think it was said on the video as well, was just getting them to take a picture and send it to me through email, and I can project it on the projector or even the television screen or something like that, and then we can have a discussion about it. So I think that's what the main thing I got from that video anyways.
Okay, very good. And we'll come back to the discussion part in a moment. And finally, Aidan, yourself, if you would share a little bit about yourself and how you would see that approach working.
Yeah, hello everybody, I'm Aidan Roach and I'm teaching in Cloister Breda in Enniscorthy. Cloister Breda is an all-girls school and I'm fitting in the middle of the other two. There's about 720 students. I'm also, I suppose, involved in the IMTA in Wexford, and I had worked with the PDST. But I'm back in the classroom now and getting to try out all the things that I was telling teachers would be very good ideas to do. And looking at this video, yeah, what I really love about it is it's aspiring us really to reach for the high levels of teaching. I find in the classroom at the moment that there's a danger with the students that are masked, and it looks that they're nearly muzzled, that the teaching has muzzled their voice, and that it's too much of my voice. And it's nice to be reminded in this video that it's the students that need to do the maths, and it's the students we need to hear. I think it was an irony within the video maybe that when you multiply AI by BI, you'll get a real number. You'll make the imaginary real. And I think that's what we're about at the moment. We're in a very different place, and it's a different place even than Garrison and Canuka in their blended learning idea. What's happening now in the classroom is the synchronous blended learning is actually happening there and then in the classroom. As Yvonne and Joe said, the students, because we can't read the work, it's working for me the same time. The students take a picture and I can project it up straight away. And it's a lovely way to have student voice in the classroom. It's a lovely way to identify, as was said in the video, the misconceptions. Just another thing that I find works very well for me, we are a Microsoft Teams school as well, but we use OneNote. So there's a class OneNote, and each of the students have their own OneNote. And I've started this year in kind of response to the reality that's there of getting the students to take a simple picture at the start of the class. So I think we're probably all in the same boat. The start of the class is 5 minutes of spraying down and plugging in. And while that is going on, I have the students, they're doing their little bit. They're taking their photograph and putting it in the homework section in OneNote. I find that I have access to information I never had before, that I get to look and see exactly not just who's doing the homework, but at a glance I get to see some of the common mistakes. It allows me to correct the homework, not always with me writing it, but with a student volunteering to let me show their work, and right or wrong, and it's just a lovely way to meet the students where they're at. So yeah, it's such an interesting time. I was fascinated that 87% of this room are already using blended learning. There's no coming back from it. This is a new time, and we're learning from each other every day.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you've all mentioned about students taking pictures of their work and sending it up, but I suppose, how do you take it to the next step? How are you using those pictures or using that work to assess students and to give them feedback, even to give them formative feedback? How is that working? Aidan, if you'd like to continue, and we'll come to the others.
Yeah. Well, it works in many ways. I suppose, and there's a danger now you nearly become too available to the students. As I'm doing this video, I see my team's little messages are popping up where you might be giving very, very direct individual feedback that you couldn't give before. So it's amazing that the student is asking very particular questions, and you can give, if you're available at the time, to give very instant feedback. But Teams does allow you, I suppose, do different things. One of the things is to give assessments and to use forms. Now, Microsoft Forms and Google Forms are all the very same, but it's a very nice way of having a test out there and having the students engage with an activity, and it can be more interesting than just static questions. You can embed video in it and have the tutorial within the forms, but you are seeing very instant, either direct multi-choice answers or again a photograph. You're seeing the mistakes and you're able to feedback.
Okay. And what about yourself, Joe? Would you do something similar, or have you any other ideas to share with our attendees?
Yeah, I do something similar to Aidan. Now, we don't use OneNote. We're not a Microsoft school. We're a G Suite, so we don't have the luxury of having OneNote. But what I usually do is ask them to send a picture up, and we'd kind of try and have a rich discussion. Now, I haven't really got to the stage of them kind of collaborating at home with each other. I haven't got there yet. I've been trying to figure it out what to do, but that OneNote idea is probably the best way, or even a Microsoft Word document, like a live Microsoft Word document or something like that, might be beneficial. But again, there might be a few kind of downfalls, like would all the students be online at the same time, or would they want to be online, obviously enough, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So what Aidan is saying is obviously brilliant with the OneNote and the collaborating together, and that the rich talking, but there's a few downfalls as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just, Joe, on the giving assessment and feedback, so you haven't got there with them doing it maybe outside of the classroom, but how are you giving them feedback in the classroom? You mentioned about them taking pictures of their work, but is it easy to assess every single student, or is it easier to assess what everyone's doing?
Yeah, again, you kind of have to be sometimes careful of what student you pick and what picture you take, or a student you ask to send a picture to. Just another thing I probably would use would be kind of polls, like you had there in the start of the video. And at the start of the week 1 or week 2, I had like a yes or no question, yes no answers, sorry, but I kind of tried to develop that to, just for an example, like that kind of video. Does the real multiply by a real? Does that give you does an imaginary multiply by imaginary give you a real, or does it give you imaginary, or something like that? So trying to develop them polls and to kind of give an instant feedback like you did with your introduction into this.
So you're really learning as you go as well.
Yeah, really learning, yeah.
And as for yourself, Yvonne, just when it comes to assessment and giving students individual feedback, how is that working for you?
So just kind of to build there on what Aidan said, we also use OneNote in our school, and I'm just going to give you an example of kind of what happened today in my class. So with my second year group, we're doing coordinate geometry, and we were doing the distance between 2 points, and we used Pythagoras theorem, and then we introduced the distance formula. So for homework, they had to, the question was to find the distance between two points, to plot it and to find the distance between 2 points. And then I just asked 4 students to volunteer to put up their homework on the board. And it was lovely to see the students, so literally 2 of the students did the distance formula, 2 of the students did Pythagoras theorem, and then a 3rd student or a 5th student said, I did it that way, but I got the wrong answer. So they snapped up a picture, and it was how they had their, you know, they read their YX instead of XY, and that's why they got the wrong answer, or the incorrect answer. But that was all, that homework was corrected, and everybody saw multiple ways of doing it, probably in less than 10 minutes. And before COVID, that would have taken me, you know, did anyone get it a different way? Let's go through that, bring them to the board. And the students got to participate in the lesson. And even the weight being lifted off me of having to go through every solution and handing that responsibility back to the student, like that is a very interesting kind of thing to do in the classroom. And it's just, it kind of takes pressure off me, and at the same time empowers the student to lead the learning in the room. And just on your other point there about correcting and assessing feedback, one kind of comment I would have there is the ease at which you can do it if you have the right hardware. And I know that like isn't something that, you know, is always very easy for teachers to do, and there isn't a massive pool of money there, you know, like you might have in a big multinational company. But moving like towards maybe getting a device that you can use a stylus on, it actually makes such a massive difference to how easily you can do your job. So once you have that, even with OneNote, you can actually correct on the screen just like it was a copy. And it would be, if people were able to do it, it would be a huge kind of gift to themselves.
And Yvonne, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pull this discussion to a close just for our second stimulus. But I'm glad you brought that up, Yvonne, because the question is after coming in from the audience. And I'm just going to put this out to any of you. This is from Jessica. Any ideas for when students don't have access to devices in the classroom?
Finally, as Aidan said, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Deal with it kindly, yeah.
Yeah. Again, look, I suppose we're all learning to adapt, aren't we, with whatever is thrown at us. Our students don't have devices, but they have phones. There's always someone whose phone is not there or charged down, but you just have to get on with it. But phones are very good, I suppose, if you have nothing else.
Okay.
In our school, they're definitely used to. They weren't at the start. They're like Aidan says, the batteries might have been dead, but they're kind of used to using it in probably all their classes throughout the day. So they're kind of getting the habit of bringing their phones fully charged and chargers with them and stuff like that. Okay, brilliant. So it built up with time. So thank you very much. I'm going to pause the discussion there, but we will be back to you in about 6.5 minutes. Okay, thank you very much.
While this task is aimed at senior cycle higher level students, the pedagogies, methodologies and ideas used could be adapted to any year and any level. Students will have worked with multiplication and polar form of complex numbers, and we are now extending the learning through the use of a rich task to investigate de Moivre's theorem. In this task we will again look at blended learning as well as using the constructivist approach. The methodologies used will include rich tasks, effective questioning, and the effective use of ICT. Here is an example of a question that could be set for students. If z is equal to 1 plus I, find z to the power of 4 in as many ways as possible. Decide on your preferred method and justify that decision. By phrasing the question in this way, we are showing students that it is not the solution, but the method that is most important. We are also asking them to justify their work, to think about what they are doing and why. This is an open question that encourages creativity and should challenge all students while at the same time ensuring that every student should see some success. Designing a rich task is not so much about the question itself, but how you use that question. Here we have chosen to ask students to find the answer in as many ways as possible, so we are looking for a variety of responses and multiple representations. By doing this, we are encouraging them to find the connections both within this topic and with other mathematics topics. The numbers have been chosen for specific reasons: that the argument is in increments of 45 degrees, the modulus is the square root of 2. Most students should be able to calculate these values by sketching a simple right-angled triangle. It is important to give students the time to come up with a variety of responses, whether this task is given at school, online or at home. Students are encouraged to actively create their own knowledge through the experiences of the rich task. We will briefly go through some of the solutions that students could come up with and the connections that could be made. Procedurally, expanding the brackets is an option. Similarly, binomial expansion could be used. Most students at this level should be able to achieve some success with either of these approaches, but there are a lot of opportunities for errors and this approach could be tedious, especially for higher powers. Students could use polar form and a table. Although the teacher may need to guide some students in this direction, all students should be able to attempt this. However, there is still some work to be done to make sense of the information, and it's still tedious for much higher powers. An Argand diagram on paper or whiteboard could be used to build on the knowledge students have recently acquired. Could your students use GeoGebra? If we open up the GeoGebra file, you will see that students can explore the file and use it to further their learning by changing the powers or the complex numbers. They should be able to see patterns in the argument, the modulus, and in the spiral shape as the exponent is increased. Using a GeoGebra file also allows them to change the complex number to see if the pattern holds for other complex numbers. This GeoGebra file is on the Padlet. The discussion part of this exercise is very important as it allows students to bring their learning together and to see other students' solutions. They can see that other students may think differently or may have arranged their thoughts in a different way. This discussion will give the teacher the opportunity to use formative assessment methods such as effective questioning to assess their students' understanding and to see where their students' thinking lies. A class discussion will also allow the teacher to lead the class in the direction they want, in this case towards the formula for de Moivre's theorem. This discussion could take place in class, but it could also take place on an online platform where students can share a picture of their work with a brief explanation. This is a question to follow on from the discussion and build on the knowledge gained. Give the students time to use the solutions they came up with to find the answer. They could discuss their thoughts in class or using an online platform facilitated by the teacher. Gather student responses, drawing attention to the fact that by using polar form to answer this question gives a much more easily obtainable and elegant solution. The teacher can share the GeoGebra file that allows students to investigate this further using any complex number. This can be done in class, with devices, or at home. The use of blended learning in this task ensures that students arrive at their conclusions in their own time, and that the teacher has more opportunities to check in with students, whether online or in class as students are working. By leaving the task open and allowing students time to come up with multiple representations, the teacher is leaving the space to scaffold and extend the task as needed. It also allows them to individualize the learning experience for students. The teacher will provide a final summary of the key learning. Students will submit a concluding statement and reflection on the learning. At the end of the discussion, students need time to reflect on the key learning, to summarize the key concepts and to formalize their conclusions.
Okay, let's rejoin our panelists. Now, thank you very much for staying with us. So Having seen that second video there, so we've just seen an example of a rich task. I suppose my question is, have you engaged in presenting rich tasks with your students in the blended learning environment? And this is more about the challenges that you might have encountered, how you overcame them, or if not, what kind of challenges do you envisage in presenting a task like this? And Joe, we might start with you because you mentioned rich tasks in the first discussion, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So just to start off, it was the have I used rich tasks? Is it?
Yeah, about the challenges that you saw and how you overcame them with using rich tasks in a blended learning environment.
Yeah, so again, I suppose I've done a rich task, obviously a few rich tasks in a blended learning environment. In my blended learning environment, I've done flipped learning, and I was kind of doing it last year as well. Just when I was lucky enough to get an iPad off the school, one of the lucky ones. So I was kind of doing the flipped learning, and the benefits with that was before COVID, obviously, was that you could give the video to the students the night before, and they could watch the video, and then they could come in and you can check their work, and the students who are usually at the top of the class would be fine, and they can continue on with some practice questions, and you can have one-on-one work with students that might be struggling with it a bit. So with in the context now, again, it kind of comes back to just the in-class formative assessment and the challenges there. But just on another point on the video was that I think the video said it was there was more importance on the method instead of the end task, and the method and the justification. So I think the justification that the students have, again, the luxury that Aidan and Yvonne use within OneNote, that I haven't really used too much yet, but just them having to justify what their work is. And I think the last question was, it's to the power of 15, the complex number to the power of 15, and them justifying, obviously the shorter and easiest way is probably the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joe. And just before I leave you, a comment came in from Robert. So thank you, Robert. And he says that for giving formative assessment, he uses Kami with Google Classroom to be able to annotate work, and work they submit as PDFs. Are you familiar with Kami on Google Classroom?
No, I've never heard of it. I'll definitely look into it though. Thanks a million.
Definitely look at it. It's spelled K-A-M-I. So thank you, Robert. And there you go, Joe. Okay, so Aidan, we might skip on to you there about how you use rich tasks like this in a blended learning, but I suppose the challenges and how you overcome.
Yeah, I suppose having been involved with lesson studies over a period of time, I suppose one of the big ideas was the rich task that you would work on. And the idea behind it was that you would have as many solutions as possible that the students would engage with the task, so that every student could engage at some level. And then you would carefully present your answers on the board, and you'd have very thoughtful board work going from the most naive to the most sophisticated solutions, where the students end up teaching each other, and it's a fantastic thing. Now, that is not so easy anymore, that you can't have the student come up to the board and you can't hand over the pen anymore. So I suppose the big challenge is, how do we do that in a new climate? I think there are ways around it, and they're not going to be perfect. The nice thing about the rich task, really, the easy part is giving the task and giving them space to engage in it. The more difficult thing is how to present that feedback in a really meaningful way, so that the students are the active learners and nearly the active teachers. I think it might be possible from the kind of thing that Yvonne has just described about her class on coordinate geometry, that if you gave the rich task and allowed the students to feedback their answers beforehand, and you had a look through them, and perhaps you were ready to maybe you could project up in large screen, but maybe you had a smaller version of it and you could have your tags available and let the student describe the work one by one and leave a record. And so that you could maybe create kind of like a Japanese board work version of the rich task, which would be a fantastic thing to see done. Maybe if there's lesson studies this year, they might enter into this space. It strikes me though from all of this, if I was to give any piece of advice maybe for teachers, it kind of comes into what was feeding back from Robert there. I think it's so important that if teachers can somehow capture the work that they're doing in class that day, however that is done. I think the easiest way to do that probably is with, as Yvonne was talking, the right device with a stylus. I think as teachers, there's no shortcut around this, we need the materials to do the work properly. We just do. And I think it brings us to new spaces though, as what we can do that now that you can annotate, and it means whatever you teach in class is just, if you do it in OneNote, for example, or any other thing, it's saved forever, and it allows the students who are not present, and there are many of them in all of our classrooms now who are not there for different reasons, it allows them in some way access to work. So I do think that there's some really interesting challenges that I think if we have this seminar in 3 months' time, I think what the teachers will be feeding back to us will be amazing. I'd love to hear what the answers are to that question, Arlene.
Yeah, it is constantly changing environment. We might just skip on to yourself, Yvonne, there. Just you have already spoken about a rich task that you did just today on your call.
To be honest, I wasn't even thinking about it as a rich task until I was watching that video. But I suppose coming from lesson study as well, you know, it really does encourage you to think as a teacher of leaving the tasks open-ended for students and providing like automatic differentiated learning, because everyone gets to achieve a level of success. But back to like the challenges. There was kind of two things that struck me. One was that, you know, accessing the files that have been created by the PDST, like they're excellent files. But I would suggest that teachers give students time to explore the simpler workings of GeoGebra before they go on to those Padlets or go on to those kind of files that you created, because otherwise they're kind of meaningless for students if they haven't actually engaged in some way with the simpler aspects of GeoGebra before they dive right into the, you know, the very complex thinking that are associated with some of those tasks.
Sorry, Yvonne, that poll that was asked at the start of this, it's on GeoGebra, so we might see the results of those now. So a lot for demonstration, so student engagement. That's very interesting. So we'd say, Yvonne, in your opinion, just having mentioned GeoGebra, how important is it to get your students to engage? And we'd say to give them the tools to allow them to learn how to use GeoGebra for themselves.
I think it's really important because even the time-consuming nature of asking them to draw out plots every time you want them to see that, say, y is equal to mx, and you want them to do 2x, 3x, 4x, and observe how that line, you know, how the slope of that line changes. Like GeoGebra transforms that in the classroom, not without even going near engaging with the files that you and, you know, your colleagues have created. So I would think it's hugely important.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Aidan?
I suppose just to add, I think GeoGebra is fantastic, and it's come on what you can do in GeoGebra. So now they do have books basically online. If you know your writers in GeoGebra, like Tim Brzezinski and some others, and you can send your students on a pathway where they would come in and they would engage in tasks that are rich and open tasks and engage with material in a self-paced, self-directed way, and you as a teacher can see the feedback and see their engagement. It's with very little input from the teacher. If you haven't looked at GeoGebra lately, I'd advise as teachers go in and have a look. Even this summer, they've come on a bit more. It's just brilliant. Like, Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Aidan. And just, Joe, do you have anything to add to that before we've got some questions coming in on the Q&A, but anything on GeoGebra?
Yeah, no, it's benefits. Aidan was excellent explanation there, the benefits of it. So I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. Dara has just asked about an effective way for students to share homework for discussion online. So I think, Yvonne, you had mentioned something about your students kind of self-correcting or creating their collaborative space. Yeah.
Well, for homework, one way I'd get them to kind of collaborate on is this on their homework at home or their homework in class?
Yeah.
It looks to me like their homework from home.
So what I do is on Teams, so it's like a blog. So if you didn't have access to Teams, you could set up a similar blog, and for every question that somebody wants to comment on or question on, they set up a new thread in the conversation. And then that night, students, if you want to help with question 3, or you want somebody to look at your answer in question 3, you take a picture of your question 3 and you put it up into that thread. Somebody else might comment on it, saying that, you know, the minus by the minus, you left it as a minus, or whatever the error was. And students are very engaged in this. Like I was very surprised by how willing students were to put up work that was, you know, that wasn't correct, and be willing for other students to comment on it, and how willing they were to ask for help.
Okay.
It's been hugely successful. I definitely would advise anyone to try it.
And when you say ask for help, you don't just mean ask for help from you, their teacher.
No, so they in Teams, you can tag the whole class and it automatically tags me as well. At the start, I definitely had to support the learning. I definitely had to say things like, you know, does anyone else have an answer? But that was actually only at the start. And I really started this, I suppose I saw the benefits of this during lockdown, and I really started trying to embed it into my classroom practice at the beginning of September. But now I'm starting to see that really I can log in to the classroom conversation in the morning, and I can see that a lot of students have actually got, say at higher level Leaving Cert really I'm talking about here, but they would have a lot of the questions sorted out and answered for themselves before they even arrive into the classroom the next day. So
wow,
it's very successful.
That's impressive. Just another question, kind of along the same lines, has come in, and it's tips for encouraging students to volunteer their homework for correction. And we might actually move on to you with that question, Joe, if that's okay.
Yeah, it was tips to...
So tips for encouraging students to volunteer their homework to be projected.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I'm in St. Gerald's, so it's an all boys school. So boys are usually kind of happy that they're doing well, or that they're showing off kind of more than anything. So maybe in an all girls school like Aidan's school. But for tips, it was kind of, again, the students who you'd know who they would have got it right maybe, or they had a good chance of getting it right, that you asked them to send their photo. And obviously you kind of would check it beforehand, and you wouldn't put up anything too embarrassing for that kind of way. So definitely for the boys, I don't really have a problem with it. Like throughout all the 6 years, for any of them, they're all very happy to throw it up. And even if they get it wrong, there might be a little bit of slag going on. So yeah, they don't mind. So
they don't mind.
Bit of enjoyment there as well. So
okay,
maybe Aidan, I think, is an all
yeah,
girls.
Aidan.
So he might.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one. My strongest instinct is you create a culture with your first years. Definitely, you get them that this is the culture, that this is something we do. That so in the pre-COVID days, you'd make sure that everyone takes the pen at some stage and comes to the board. I think look, it is classroom climate here. Like this is a classroom management issue, but you have to make it okay for students as well to trust that it's okay to give the wrong answer. And I think that's really important, because the learning really comes from the misconceptions. And so I suppose you learn to affirm the effort, and you learn to say, I always want to put up and say, I'm so happy that you made this mistake. Or you say, Takayashi, and he was over in Ireland, but then he called it a beautiful mistake or something. But there's so much learning in the students' mistakes that there's not as much learning if it's just the good students and the stuff going up all the time.
Yeah.
Also, if it was a trick from lesson study that we had. If students have done something well, particularly if you're using something like OneNote and they've put up the homework beforehand, you can feed back to that student and say, that's a really good answer. Is it okay if I share with that? And you make it okay before the classroom is another tack that works. And I suppose you tell them the rules in the classroom, everyone is going to share.
Yes, absolutely. And just again, it's kind of coming from that, and this is a question from Caroline about students who are struggling or intimidated by the technology or the techniques that other students might be using. So did you have any issues with students who are afraid of using the technology in the first place? Aidan, we'll continue with yourself.
Well, look, training is required and small steps, and you need to bring your students along slowly. So you don't launch in with it all in one go. You have to let students find their way. So it starts in small steps. So the first small step was I created space in class for the students just to take a picture and send it to me in the simplest way. So that was the first step. And the next day you're building up on that. But it becomes culture slowly. So small steps, and give time in class to do it, I would say, and re-explain it and make sure that they all understand. And I say with my first years this year, the very last of them managed to access it one by one, and ask them to ask their friends maybe for help as well, because they will help each other.
Okay. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't know where the time has gone, but I'm going to throw one question out for each of you just to wrap up this discussion. And that is, if you could give just one valuable piece of advice based on your experience to those attending this webinar, what would it be? Yvonne, we might start with you.
Yeah, so my piece of advice would be just to try things out and don't be afraid to get it wrong. In my experience, we're all learning, the students are learning, and they're very appreciative of every single effort that I make as a teacher to try and improve their learning. So if I make mistakes, they're very, very accepting of the mistakes. They're very willing to let it go, and they're also very willing to help me and say, well, no, if you do it this way, this will be better. Just to be willing to make a mistake and willing to give it a go. And start small.
Start small. That's a very good piece of advice. What about yourself, Joe?
Yeah, definitely collaboration. Even what's happening there, we had a meeting before this about, I think Aidan told me about having a Google form, having the video in before the Google form or something like that. So even that kind of collaboration between teachers is hugely important, especially now. And there might be, I know I'm a little bit stereotypical here, but younger teachers might be better at technology, but Aidan's obviously, he might be older. I don't know if he is or not.
Thanks, Joe.
But that kind of, like, he obviously has done that and it worked for him. So definitely that collaboration works very well. And to just pick up what Yvonne said as well, that the method and justification are very, very important, and the students' responsibility for their own learning. So it kind of definitely benefits the older students who maybe are in 5th year, 6th year, kind of there as they go into college. That's what they'll be dealing with, their own learning, and they have to focus on that themselves. That doesn't really matter about anybody else, that they're just themselves.
That's very true. Yeah, very true. So the learning and the skills they're acquiring now will help them in the longer term.
And even if you're giving them free recorded video, it's their own. I always say that, but they're kind of all doing it. Hopefully, it's their own learning, so they kind of should view it. So, and should view it as much time as they want, that kind of way. So just kind of putting the responsibility back on them and stop spoon feeding them as much, I suppose.
Good advice there. Thank you, Joe. And finally, Aidan, the last word.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with what Joe and Yvonne had been saying there in terms of collaboration and take small steps. If I was to say what my favorite things are, the advice, there's a room here with 87% of the teachers here today are already on this journey, very clearly so. If I was to say my 3 favorite things, I would do: get a stylus, get something that you can write with, I think. Use OneNote. It's no matter which platform you're using, you have access at least to a OneNote that allows you, without pressing save ever, to have your class recorded, just the notes kept. And if you haven't gone down the journey yet, learn to use Microsoft Forms or Google Forms. It'll save you such an amount in what seems like an impossible time to do corrections. So there would be my 3 big tips. So best of luck with everyone going at that, I'd say.
Yeah, fantastic, and I'm sure everyone watching will really appreciate those pieces of advice. So if we just hang on, we've got about 3 minutes left before we say goodbye to everyone. But thank you so much, Aidan, Joe, and Yvonne, for your input. Let me just pop back. Okay, so here's a quick reminder of our key messages for this webinar. I'll give you a moment just to remind yourself of those. So to support teachers in the teaching of mathematics through blended learning, we, the PTST Post-Primary Maths team, will be running online professional learning communities starting in October, so this month. The PLCs will involve small groups of teachers meeting online to share their practice and experiences. Now, this will be teacher-driven, where teachers can discuss their needs with support from us. To express your interest in this initiative, we will share a link to the expression of interest form, so it should arrive in your chat function. There will also be a link in the Padlet page that you should get, will have received earlier, and will come in the email that's to go out in a couple of days, probably on Monday. And for further details about this, do not hesitate to contact any member of our team. Also, this November and December, we'll be running workshops dedicated to the topic of complex numbers. For more information and booking details, keep an eye on the Project Maths website, the PTST online booking page, our newsletter, and our Twitter account. And we also have workshops on geometry and calculus in the coming months. So here's a reminder of the supports available from the team for this webinar, that Padlet page. And PTST advisors are available to support schools with their specific needs in relation to the teaching of mathematics. To book a school support session, log on to www.ptst.ie/school support using your school's roll number and the password schoolsupport2020. And please note, all school supports should be booked in consultation with school management. My first thank you is to our 3 panelists for their excellent contribution to this evening's webinar, and I'm sure you'll all agree that we have learned a huge amount from them. So thank you so much, Aidan, Joe, and Yvonne. Next, I want to thank all of you, our attendees, for taking the time to attend our webinar and contribute to the Q&A and to the polls. I really hope you found it worthwhile and beneficial. And just to let you know, this webinar is about to end. So once again, thank you for your attention and have a good night.